Welcome to Orensha Tech's PowerShell series. In this video, we're going to go over filtering. And to start us off, let's look at the two basic filtering techniques that we have. The first is using the filtering native in the Cmdlet that we're using to get the data in the first place. So let's look at an example of this to show you what we're talking about. So we took the getProcess commandlet and used the name parameter to filter on any process named PWSH. So this is the preferred filtering technique, and that is because we are filtering out the objects that we don't need right at the very beginning. And the second filtering technique that we have is using a secondary commandlet to take all the objects from the first commandlet through the pipeline and filter based on an expression that we choose. So let's look at this same example using that second technique. So we take our commandlet getProcess, pipe it into whereObject, which is our filtering commandlet, and then we're going to take any object with the name of PWSH and return it to the host. So we can see here, both of these techniques return the same exact results, but this first one is the preferred one because we are doing a lot less typing, a lot less work, and we're filtering out the objects that we don't need from the very beginning. And this becomes increasingly important when we're passing objects and data over the network, or we're getting data from cloud services. So by filtering data from the very beginning, we're reducing that network load and not having to filter it out later. However, the catch with this first filtering technique is that we are bound to the parameters that the commandlet gives us. So as we can see with getProcess, we have the name parameter that allows us to filter on the name. And let's run the help on getProcess so we can see some of the other ones. So we can see here that we also have ID, but again, if we wanted to run some more complex expressions, we really can't do that. We have to stick to the parameters that the commandlet gives us. And that is where the secondary filtering technique comes into play, because we have a lot more power to filter on exactly what we want. Although with the second filtering technique, that does mean that we need to understand how comparison operators work in the context of PowerShell. So let's jump into that and take a look at comparison operators. And I've got a listing here of all of the comparison operators and their syntax in PowerShell. So we can see here they all start with a hyphen. And then we have EQ for equal, NE for not equal, and then we have GE and LE for greater than or equal and less than or equal. Then we have GT and LT for greater than or less than. And something to be aware of is that none of these first ones up here are going to be case sensitive. So it's going to look for the same word, whether it has a capital letter or not. But if we did want to filter specifically on case sensitivity, we have all of these operators with C at the beginning that's going to turn those into case-sensitive operators. So definitely something to be very familiar with, all of these operators, because when we start using the whereObject commandlet, these are the tools that you're going to use to get the data that you want. Now looking at this first batch here, these are all going to return either a true or false Boolean value. So the way that this works is you're giving PowerShell an expression and you're using one of these operators, and if it's true, it will keep the object in the pipeline, and if it's false, it will remove it. And that's where these other comparison operators come into play. We've got and, or, and not. So looking at an example of and, if we have 50 is greater than 1, well, this is true. The AND operator checks whether both of these things are true. So the second expression, 3 is greater than 5, is false. So this whole expression will return false because the AND dictates that both or all of the expressions have to be true. Now, OR only looks if one expression is true out of a group. So we have the same two expressions here, and since this first one is true and the second is false, it will return true because at least one of them is true. Now, the not comparison operator just reverses the true or false value return. So if we had something like the get process responding property, which is either going to be a true or false value, we can use the not operator to check whether the opposite is true. Now, moving on here, we have the like operator, the match operator, and then some of these other operators that build on that match operator. The not match, the C match, and the C not match. And remember, the C just means that it is checking for case sensitivity. So let's look at the main difference between the like operator and the match operator. So here's an example of like, just to break down exactly what's happening. So if we had the word PowerShell being returned to us in the pipeline, and we wanted to look whether that was like the wildcard shell, this would return true. And remember, the wildcard is looking for anything, whether that's one character or multiple characters. So this is going to return true because this expression is contained within this string value. So like is really looking whether the thing that you specify is contained in the object that is being given in the pipeline for that comparison check. And then this differentiates with match because match compares a string with a regular expression pattern. And this can be a little confusing, and I would guide everyone to read the About Comparison Operators manual just to become a lot more familiar with the differences between all of these different operators and how they work. All right, moving on, we're going to look at where object a little deeper because this is just a super powerful commandlet, and you're going to end up using this a lot in your time in PowerShell. So let's look up the help for where object. So we can see here that the filter script parameter is positional. So we're oftentimes not going to even see this parameter in forums and other places you might see where object being used. And let's look at an example of this. So we can see that our filter script parameter is not used here. And let's break down exactly what's happening. So get process is getting all of the process objects that we have on our computer, and it pipes it into the where object commandlet, where we're then using this expression to filter. So each of the objects is passed into this expression to check whether it's true or false. And if it's true, it will keep it in the pipeline. If it's false, it will dismiss it. So for each object, and we're using this $_ to reference the object in the pipeline, we're checking whether the name property is like P wildcard. So anything that starts with P, or it could just be P, is going to be returned true and be kept in the pipeline, which we can see here. We have a few process objects that start with P and were returned to us. And of course, in this instance, it was returned to the host, but we could always store this in a variable or something to continue manipulating the data. And just to reiterate exactly what this is, this $_ is a place marker for the current object in the pipeline. And then we use that period dot name, and this is going to be any property. So always use your get member commandlet to look for property names so that you can use them in your filtering using this format. And just to hit it home here, this is only going to be able to succeed in instances where we only have one object in the pipeline at a time. So to really look at what where object is doing, it's creating a loop where it's putting just one object at a time in the pipeline to check and return either a true or a false. And something else I want to just point out is the alias for where object, because you're probably going to see this in forums, and I just want you to be aware what the alias is so that you know what you're looking at if you come across it. And the alias is just where. So let's look at an example of this so you know what I'm talking about. So oftentimes you're just going to see where name like some expression here. So it's the exact same thing as above. You will see this a lot. Again, it does save you some typing if you want to use that. But if you're ever going to be writing scripts, then be sure to use the full commandlet name, especially easy when you have tab completion. And before we move on, I just want to state one more time that you're going to want to filter left as often as possible. So we have our get process. It had some parameters that we could use like name or ID to filter out the objects that we want. But in the case that we can't use that, then we're going to be using this secondary technique where we take the where object commandlet or some other commandlet and filter the objects further. And best practice is always to filter out the most amount of objects that you can with the first pass so that we're reducing the amount of data that's being passed through the pipeline or over the network, either from another computer or a cloud service. So just remember that. Always filter left as much as you can. And the last thing that I want to show you in this video is nested pipelines. So let's look at some commandlets here to show you just how clunky PowerShell can get because of how powerful it is in the ability to use nested pipelines. So we're taking get process and using the name parameter, and then in parentheses, we're actually going to put another command with another pipeline here. So here we're using get content to get the values in our processes.txt file, and then passing that through the pipeline and filtering with our where object commandlet for any of those string values that start with W. And then those string values end up getting placed here in the name parameter of get process. But we're not going to stop there. We're going to pass this down the pipeline more. So to finish this out, we took the objects returned and filtered on any that were not responding. So again, responding is giving us a true or false value. So to return the objects with a false value, we're using the not operator to flip that and be true, which is then going to return it in our pipeline and eventually to the host. Now, this can just get really clunky because we've got two pipelines. We could take it even further. There's really no limit to the amount of pipelines. It just gets clunky and confusing. So I want to show you this here. If we're ever putting it into a script, there's ways we can make it a little bit more readable for those who come along after us. So we've got our get process with our name parameter, and then we're using our parentheses, and then we break the line on the pipeline character here. And then we continue on with the rest of this inside of the parentheses, and again break the line on the pipeline character and finish up with the rest of our command here. So just a simple technique that we can use to make something a little bit more readable. There are a few other techniques that we can use, and we'll get into those in some later videos. But for now, that wraps up this video on filtering. In the next video, we're going to go over running commands remotely on other computers. But until then, thanks for watching and have a good day.